Okay, everybody, we're going to get started then. So thank you all for joining us today for our final virtual seminar series of the fall 2015 semester. Today we have the pleasure of having Jeremy Young joining us, and he is actually the project manager for disaster planning for Historic Properties Initiative for the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office. And today he's going to be talking to us about disaster planning for historic properties. So he's a native of the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Jeremy recently returned to the Keystone State from Portland, Oregon, where he earned his master's degree in urban and regional planning with a specialization in regional economic development, and a graduate certificate in real estate development from Portland State University's NOHAD Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning and Center for Real Estate. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Geography from Millersville University of Pennsylvania, where he specialized in geospatial applications and minored in history. Since becoming project manager for Pennsylvania's Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative last year, Jeremy has quickly become one of few experts in the state on the topic of integrating historic property considerations into the hazard mitigation planning process. As this important step has not been taken to date in the U.S., with the exception of a few cities, he is working to produce a model for this type of activity that can be replicated by planners and places throughout Pennsylvania and the nation. So thank you so much for coming, and Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure to be here today, and a pleasure to be in the company of students at Millersville University, my alma mater. Thank you to the Center for Disaster Research and Education for hosting me today and providing the opportunity to speak on one of our new programs here at the State Historic Preservation Office. I thought before I get started, I'd provide a little background about what my agency does. The State Historic Preservation Office is one of several bureaus in the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's official history agency. And the role of the State Historic Preservation Office is to identify and protect the architectural and archaeological resources of Pennsylvania, and it's our responsibility to work with individuals, communities, local governments, and state and federal agencies to educate Pennsylvanians about our heritage and its value, to build better communities through preservation tools and strategies, to provide strong leadership, both individually and through partnerships, and to ensure the preservation of Pennsylvania's heritage. Some of our core responsibilities are included here. We undertake the duties of Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office, of which there are state historic preservation offices throughout the country. We help to implement the National Historic Preservation Act, federal legislation enacted in 1966, which we're getting ready to celebrate the 50th anniversary of next year. We have a historic preservation board which governs our activities. We prepare a statewide historic preservation plan every 5 years. We're getting ready to update that again in the next year. We administer the National Register of Historic Places program. The National Register of Historic Places is the nation's inventory of places worthy of preservation. And we populate the Cultural Resources GIS, Geographic Information System, which is Pennsylvania's inventory of all National Register eligible and listed properties. We administer the Keystone Historic Preservation Grant Program to assist communities to repair and restore historic properties in their communities and plan for those properties. We also administer the Historical Marker Program. You may have seen our navy blue and gold signs throughout the Commonwealth marking the location of a historic site. So, with all that being said, you're probably wondering, what is the State Historic Preservation Office doing in the hazard mitigation business? Well, in 2012, in October 2012, Hurricane Sandy changed everything for us, you could say. Hurricane Sandy, one of the worst disasters our nation has experienced to date. Hurricane Sandy represents the second time that funding has been provided to states to recover important historic places. Hurricane Katrina, when it devastated the Gulf Coast, represents the first time. And after Hurricane Sandy, we were awarded a $1.5 million grant from the National Park Service of the U.S. Department of the Interior to focus on helping the owners of historic properties repair their properties that were damaged by Hurricane Sandy. Also to undertake municipal and county hazard mitigation planning to incorporate and prioritize historic properties, provide training and educational programs such as this one today, and develop model guidance and hazard mitigation demonstration projects throughout the Commonwealth for historic properties. Fortunately, we weren't able to identify very much damage throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania resulting from Hurricane Sandy. Ironically, the year prior to Hurricane Sandy, 2011, Pennsylvania saw widespread damage as a result of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. We saw significant flooding throughout the Commonwealth. But at that time, Congress didn't award funds for historic properties. So we are grateful for this award from the National Park Service, and although we didn't identify very much Sandy damage, we have funded some grants to help the owners of historic properties repair those properties. The large majority of the $1.5 million we've dedicated to helping counties to plan for future disasters. Very briefly, I thought I'd touch on those grant projects that we funded in communities throughout Pennsylvania. In Easton, well, backing up a step, during Hurricane Sandy, we didn't see the type of damage that our neighbors to the east and to the northeast, New York and New Jersey, saw, where they had their coastal areas completely devastated by hurricane surge. We saw mostly wind damage here in Pennsylvania, particularly closer to the Delaware River on the eastern border of the state. We saw properties such as this one here in the city of Easton in Northampton County, slate shingles blown off of roofs. We also saw many trees come down throughout the state, power lines. Unfortunately, one of our cemeteries in Easton had over 25 large legacy trees fall down, damaging wrought iron fencing and monuments there. And so between those two properties, those are the only two properties that applied for funding through our office, despite a good deal of outreach to the communities seeking participants in the grant program. But we have awarded approximately $130,000 to assist folks with repairing their properties so that we can preserve these for future generations. Planning for future disasters, which is what the bulk of our Hurricane Sandy funding is dedicated to. Over 90% of the funding will be dedicated to helping communities prepare for future disasters. It's important to recognize that traditionally folks in the historic preservation field battle a series of common threats on a day-to-day basis. Typically it's encroaching development, alteration to historic properties that changes the look and feel of those properties, or neglect, lack of maintenance, which causes historic properties to deteriorate. Until Hurricane Sandy and our Hurricane Sandy grant, our office, the State Historic Preservation Office, hadn't been very proactive thinking about some of the natural threats to our historic properties in the Commonwealth, floods and tornadoes and the like. So really this represents the first time that, in many ways, that we're focusing on these threats. Time and time again, we see natural disasters devastate our historic resources. Here's the town of Bloomsburg during Tropical Storm Lee. The town was flooded significantly. We see tornadoes from time to time in Pennsylvania. This one devastated the Kinzua Viaduct in McKean County. Fires, whether they're man-made, arson, or wildfire. This one in Berks County destroyed by arson, sadly, in this past year. Sinkholes in the southeastern, south-central part of Pennsylvania, particularly in Millersville Borough in Lancaster County, where you're all studying. The photos here show the sinkholes that recently impacted Palmyra in Lebanon County, which, by the way, just received a FEMA grant to repair or fill in these sinkholes to address this damage. But historic preservation and emergency management, two fields that typically don't interact with one another, but have several similarities. Historic preservation, for example, began roughly 50 years ago in our country, and it began as a reaction to the widespread destruction of important historic properties. There's Penn Station in New York City in 1960, which was a big catalyst for the preservation movement. Historic preservation, in response, since those early days, has allowed for the protection of many historic properties and cultural resources before they're threatened with alteration or demolition. Emergency management, similarly, began as a reaction to the devastating impacts of natural disasters. And emergency management, or hazard mitigation in particularly, allows for the protection of life and property. But when we combine historic preservation and emergency management, or hazard mitigation, when we include historic property considerations into the hazard mitigation planning process, we can help to not only protect life and property, which is the major focus of emergency management professionals, but we can also help to preserve place and sense of place and preserve communities. The Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative of the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office is about prioritizing historic properties within the disaster cycle for the first time. Typically, PEMA and FEMA and the State Historic Preservation Office, we often find out about historic properties that have been impacted by disasters after the fact, many weeks after the storm, after a damage assessment has occurred. But how do we prioritize? How do we move those into the planning stages to be a bit more proactive? This is all about being proactive. And the vehicle that we hope to use in cooperation with PEMA and FEMA here at the state and federal level is the State and Local Hazard Mitigation Plan. Counties in Pennsylvania are required to have a hazard mitigation plan in order to become eligible for federal assistance following a disaster event. Why should we prioritize and plan for historic properties? Well, historic properties inform citizens of their unique local heritage, their cultural identity, the very beginnings of their community. They are the foundations of the community's built environment and provide a familiar sense of place. They are what makes places what they are. And very often in Pennsylvania, one of the oldest states in the Union, our historic properties are very valuable economic assets and tourism attractions. In Pennsylvania, tourism is the #2 economy, or #2 sector of the economy, rather, after agriculture. So historic properties add a lot of value to communities in Pennsylvania. Why should we prioritize and plan for historic properties? Well, it's also our responsibility at the state and local government level here in Pennsylvania. The Constitution of Pennsylvania declares that the people have a right to the preservation of historic and aesthetic values of the environment, and that these resources are the common property of the people, including generations yet to come. And as trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth and its local jurisdictions shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people. Communities in many ways already plan for their historic resources. The Pennsylvania Municipalities Planning Code requires that all counties have a comprehensive plan, and that comprehensive plan has a section dedicated to historic preservation so that historic sites can be preserved. Although, unfortunately, while counties are required to have a plan for historic preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office's assessment of those plans is that they're often very bare bones. In some cases, many communities don't have the capacity to properly plan for their resources, and so that's something that our office tries to help communities with on a regular basis. But despite those plans, those county comprehensive plans being not very robust, I guess one could say, I did pull some language from some of those county comprehensive plans, from several of those plans throughout the Commonwealth, and I want to see if you can try to pull out some main themes here from some of the language. This quote here from the Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan Lancaster County's greatest assets are its historic buildings, landscapes, and cultural traditions. Without them, the county loses its identity. Lycoming County, one of our other Susquehanna River counties, cultural and historical resources are an integral part of the overall quality of life in the county. Chester County, preserving historic resources is crucial to sustaining the quality of life in the county. Monroe County, historic resources are a vital part of the county's character. They contribute to tourism, and they play an important role in the economy. Hopefully now you're starting to recognize some common themes here. In Lehigh and Northampton counties, historic properties add beauty and attractiveness to the region. They increase understanding and appreciation of our heritage and improve quality of life. Once again, they're an important part of the economy. Huntingdon County in central Pennsylvania notes that many of its historic resources are settled along rivers and creeks, and thus flooding is a threat to many of their historic towns and settlements. And they go further to note that hazard mitigation could benefit from including historic resources in their plans, in their planning processes. This is the first county that I was able to identify of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania that's starting to think proactively about this idea of including historic properties into the hazard mitigation planning process. Aside from the effort that our office is currently engaged in several counties. On that note, related to Huntingdon County and many of its historic settlements being located along riverfronts and being flood prone, flooding is the #1 natural threat facing Pennsylvania communities. In fact, all 67 counties have identified flooding as the #1 natural threat to life and safety. Pennsylvania has 86,000 miles of streams, making it the state with the second highest stream miles in the nation after Alaska. And when you couple that with the fact that Pennsylvania is one of the earliest settled states in the United States, many of our historic settlements are right on the rivers because our earliest settlements relied on rivers for transportation and industry. This map here shows the percentage of housing stock built 1960 or earlier. The darker concentrations represent larger concentrations of older buildings. This is one of our outreach tools that we use to get communities thinking about where their older settlements are in relation to the floodplains. It's hard to see the special flood hazard areas on the map, but if you squint your eyes, you can see them in red there. But not only is flooding a major threat to our communities and particularly our historic properties in Pennsylvania, but climate scientists in Pennsylvania have noted in a recent report to the Department of Environmental Protection that flooding is only going to get worse in Pennsylvania. And so adaptation strategies that focus on increasing flood preparedness and resilience are of high priority. And so it's imperative that we start to think more proactively about our historic properties in flood-prone areas. So recognizing the threats to historic properties throughout the Commonwealth from a variety of hazards, including flooding, we've developed the Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative, which will help a series of pilot project counties through 2017 to integrate historic property information into their hazard mitigation plans for the very first time. We've broken the initiative down into 2 phases. Phase 1 will be identifying the county's most hazard-prone historic resources through a careful historic resource survey and recording hazard-specific information for vulnerability assessments. Phase 2 will involve some detailed vulnerability assessments, trying to understand exactly how vulnerable those resources are to various disasters and developing strategies to protect them during and in the aftermath of future natural disasters. And it's important to include those strategies to protect those resources into the FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plans, because if they're not in the hazard mitigation plans, they won't be eligible for federal funding or grants from FEMA to help protect them. So here we have outlined here the 4 pilot project counties of the Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative. All of the blue counties represent the 18 counties that received the Presidential disaster declaration following Hurricane Sandy. We have to spend our Hurricane Sandy disaster relief grant in those 18 counties. Unfortunately, we can't spend it elsewhere. And from those 18 counties that received disaster declarations, we wanted to identify counties that were required to update their FEMA-approved hazard mitigation plan by 2017. And we sent letters out to 6 counties and received an expression of interest from these 4. Monroe County up in the Poconos along the Delaware River, Cameron County up in the Pennsylvania wildlands, Bedford County down in the southern region of the state, and the city of Philadelphia. We ended up with a wide variety of counties, a great diversity in demographics and population, and a diversity of historic resources. But these 4 counties, by participating in our Disaster Planning for Historic Properties initiative, will become, we believe, the first counties in the United States to take on integrating historic properties into their hazard plans. And so in many cases, Pennsylvania is at the forefront of this exciting new venture. Maryland to the south is also beginning to integrate historic properties into their hazard plans as well. I guess you could say this isn't the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office's first foray into hazard mitigation planning. Over a decade ago in 2002, our office cooperated with Pima and FEMA and the borough of Milton, one of our Susquehanna river towns in Northumberland County, to develop guidance for Pennsylvania's flood-prone river towns. So we sought to identify the least intrusive techniques for the most historic buildings while using a variety of techniques for different buildings and eliminating as much risk as possible from flooding in that historic town. Bear with me, it looks like one of our slides is still loading. I'll move along. So the guidance that Pennsylvania produced in 2002 for one of its Susquehanna river towns, Milton, helped to inform the development of a new guide by FEMA in 2005, integrating historic property and cultural resource considerations into the hazard mitigation planning process. This guidance looks beyond flood hazards and also includes considerations for earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes, other severe wind events, and wildfires. So it's pretty comprehensive in that regard. And while it's from 2005, it's a decade old at this point, but I stress to many of our communities throughout Pennsylvania that the guidance is still very relevant and it's still a wonderful tool. In fact, the guidance from FEMA will form the foundation of our Disaster Planning for Historic Properties initiative with an interesting twist here and there. But just like the FEMA guide, the 2002 Milton Rivertown guidance is also very relevant, and we continue to push that toward our river towns with historic districts. So with that being said, I thought I'd run you through phase 1. I'll run you through the 4 phases of the FEMA guidance integrating historic property and cultural resource considerations into the hazard planning process, recognizing that this is a great tool. We want to familiarize you with the process for how to engage in such an activity, but also bearing in mind that the first of our pilot projects for the Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative are just getting started. The first 2 of the 4 counties are just getting started. In fact, they just got started at the beginning of November this month with the survey portion of the effort. Monroe County and Philadelphia are the first 2 of the 4, and Monroe and Bedford and Cameron counties will get started with their survey effort, their phase 1 in the spring. So phase 1 of the FEMA guidance for integrating historic properties into the hazard planning process, it's all about building a complete and balanced team, organizing your resources, identifying funding to begin planning for your historic resources within a disaster planning context. But this one here, building a complete and balanced planning team, is very important because there are several parties that to date have been absent from the hazard mitigation planning process. Those folks that have that intimate knowledge of historic properties in the communities where we develop these plans. Historic preservation or heritage planners, which you can often find at the county level in the county planning department. Preservation architects, architects that have expertise in rehabilitating old historic buildings. State, regional, and local historical societies. Local, state, and federal agencies that specialize in historic preservation and emergency management. So the State Historic Preservation Office, PEMA, and FEMA. FEMA, by the way, has, in addition to their hazard mitigation planning division, they also have an EHP division, or an environmental and historic preservation division, which conducts reviews of properties prior to funding FEMA hazard mitigation grant programs to ensure that those projects don't have negative impacts on historic properties. So they do have a great deal of expertise in preservation at FEMA as well. We also will seek to engage business and development organizations in historic districts, those Main Street organizations or agricultural preserve organizations. But very importantly, we'd like to bring academia into the conversation. PEMA and FEMA very recently have recognized that academia has been absent from the process all along since the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, which required counties to have hazard mitigation plans to be eligible for planning assistance. So we're excited to see that Millersville University has a Master's of Science in Emergency Management program, and we're thrilled that you're interested in our Disaster Planning for Historic Properties initiative. And if there are ways that we can bring some of the students into some of these projects, I'd love to hear about it, and feel free to reach out. I'll provide my contact information at the end of the slideshow today. Phase 2 is about assessing the risks to historic properties. Fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel with regard to identifying those hazard areas that will strike our communities. The state all hazard mitigation plan, as are the local hazard mitigation plans, are a very good resource, and we don't have to reinvent the wheel there. We already know where those disasters or those hazards are likely to strike in our communities. So the next step is to identify where our historic properties are in relation to those areas. Unfortunately, I'm having difficulty. Some of my slides aren't appearing on the screen, so if you see a blank slide, I think that's the reason for that. But we've begun to identify our historic resources within various hazard areas in our pilot project communities, or our counties rather. And in Monroe County, we were able to identify where buildings are in the flood hazard areas. We have building points here from the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources PA MAP program. So these points represent the center of buildings. And when we overlay the FEMA special flood hazard areas, the areas subject to a 100-year flood event, we also added the 500-year flood hazard areas, by the way. When we overlay those over the building centroids, we can identify what buildings are within the 100 and 500-year floodplains. And so in Monroe County and in Bedford and Cameron counties, we've done similar analysis, and we've been able to identify how many properties approximately, or how many buildings are within those flood hazard areas. And having this information will help us to prioritize areas throughout the county for survey. And in our 4 pilot project counties, we've decided to focus on that #1 hazard threatening Pennsylvania communities, and that's flooding. So after running the analysis in GIS, we've identified over 2,700 flood-prone buildings in Monroe County, over 2,200 in Bedford County, and in Cameron County as well. And from there, we can begin to overlay historic aerial photographs, historic maps over those building points to try to identify buildings which are at least 50 years old or older. Buildings 50 years old or older are typically eligible for a first look at National Register eligibility. And so we can start to recognize concentrations of potentially historic buildings this way. I included a screenshot here from our work in Monroe County. Our survey crews, as I mentioned, began their survey effort at the beginning of this month. We procured the services of AECOM Technical Services Incorporated, who is our contractor for phase 1 of the Disaster Planning for Historic Properties Initiative in the 4 project counties. And all of the dots on the map there that are green are properties that have already been surveyed. So as you can see, they've already surveyed quite a number of properties in Monroe, quite a number of the 2,700 or so properties that are flood prone. And they're actually using an open source data collection tool called Fulcrum, which is very similar to the folks that are familiar with GIS out there. This program is very similar to ArcGIS Collector, which is a great mobile data collection tool that can be used out in the field to survey. Here's an example of one of the buildings that the survey crews have identified in the floodplains in Monroe County this week, in fact. Chris, what I may do, because the number of my slides are not appearing, I may go to screen share. Please bear with me here. It looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Hopefully you can all see my desktop. What I'm going to do is open that up so you can all see some of the slides which were not appearing before. So picking up where we left off, thank you for your patience. When our survey crews are out in the field, they're collecting information about historic properties that typically isn't recorded about historic properties. For example, the survey crews are collecting information about primary building materials and structural system, current physical condition, noting that when properties are already fairly deteriorated, if a disaster could strike, it could exacerbate the damage to the building if there's already some level of deterioration there. Building features that may be susceptible to local hazards. For example, a gabled roof or a pointed roof may be more likely to succumb to a severe wind event than a flat roof. Character defining architectural details, those that unique craftsmanship that is often considered irreplaceable. And when we have that kind of information documented, if there is a disaster to strike that property, those unique handcrafted architectural details could be recreated and restored. They'll also be collecting information from the county tax parcel record, the county's record of property value. The market and assessed value will be used to develop historic building replacement costs. in the event of a future disaster, which will also be helpful in developing the mitigation strategies and help to inform the benefit cost analysis that's necessary for various grants from FEMA. For the first time, this survey will capture elevation information about historic properties and floodplains. If you're familiar with the National Flood Insurance Program, the National Flood Insurance Program requires that buildings constructed after December 31st, 1974 have an elevation certificate. For any properties that are out there in our pilot project counties that have been under the same ownership since 1975 or earlier that are in the floodplains, there is no elevation certificate available. And so we don't know how those buildings are vulnerable to flooding. So collecting information on the lowest adjacent grade, the openings of the elevations of any openings, including basement doors or windows, and the first floor elevation, which represents the first level of habitable space. When we compare that information with the approximate elevation of the base flood or the 100-year flood, we can begin to understand just exactly how those buildings could flood and how they could become damaged. And so we can take appropriate measures from there. In Philadelphia, we've got beyond the 100 and 500-year flood hazard areas mapped, as you can see here from FEMA's National Flood Hazard Layer. We also have, due to some unique threats related to flooding that we have in Philadelphia, we've got information on sea level rise. And yes, Philadelphia is vulnerable to sea level rise due to its location on the Delaware estuary. It's vulnerable to tidal flows. And so a new data tool from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding Impacts Viewer, which I recommend you explore when you have an opportunity. It's a great tool, and it provides communities with a chance to visualize that flood threat. At the bottom right there, you can see a picture of one of our National Historic Landmarks in Philadelphia, Fort Mifflin, which contributed to the nation's fight for independence. This is what Fort Mifflin would look like under regular tidal flooding at 6 feet of sea level rise. And as it's vulnerable to tidal flooding, Philadelphia is also therefore vulnerable to hurricane surge, like many of our coastal communities like New Jersey and the Maryland shore. You can see here on this map, areas in red could be subject to more than 9 feet of flood water in a Category 4 hurricane. Although rest assured that a Category 4 hurricane is rather unlikely in Philadelphia. The Mayor's Office of Sustainability in Philadelphia has assured me that a Category 1 hurricane is more likely based on the historical record. But in any case, still good to identify areas that may be subject to hurricane surge inundation there. We ran some analysis in GIS for Philadelphia like we did in our other 3 pilot project counties before sending the survey crews out to collect that building elevation data. And as you can see, quite a number of buildings are flood prone in Philadelphia, one of Pennsylvania's earliest settlements. As you can see, over 1,000 are flood prone, in fact, and that number reflects the number of buildings that could become inundated during a 100-year flood event, a 500-year flood event, a Category 1 hurricane, inundation from storm surge, or up to 6 feet of sea level rise. And in fact, the largest concentration of flood-prone properties is in Center City, which is in fact the oldest settled area of the city of Philadelphia. And the second largest area for concentration of flood-prone properties is in the Manayunk area, which many of you may be familiar with, which is in the northwestern part of the city. A lot of old industrial buildings there, and a very vibrant Main Street. Here this table shows the number of properties by their historical designation which are vulnerable to the various flood scenarios that I mentioned. The great majority in Philadelphia are vulnerable to the 500-year flood events, over 1,000 as you can see there. But many of the properties in that 1,052 that have been identified as flood prone are subject to more than one type of flooding scenario, and so that's important to note. Thought I'd provide a few examples of some of the more high-profile historic properties that are flood prone in Philadelphia. Here's Fort Mifflin again, down in the southern end of the city along the Delaware River. The Fairmount Waterworks on the Schuylkill River, another National Historic Landmark. Boathouse Row, another National Historic Landmark on the Schuylkill River. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard on the Delaware River. And here's the Commandant's headquarters there at the Delaware, at the Philadelphia Shipyard rather, Naval Shipyard. Municipal piers on the Delaware River. And Main Street, Manayunk. Again, these places for Philadelphians, they help to shape the place that the people of Philadelphia live and work in there. And if these places were lost, a sense of their identity could be lost. So under the FEMA guidance, phase 2, assessing the risks, we continue here with establishing a preservation hierarchy. So prioritizing all of those properties that have been identified as flood prone, for example, and try to determine which properties the community would miss most if they were destroyed by a disaster. And so prioritizing those properties. And it's really important to note that public input is critical during this process to prioritize properties. You never want the state or the local government telling those residents in that community which properties to care about and which properties to prioritize. And it's very often or very likely that if the state government was responsible for identifying those properties or prioritizing them, that there may be properties that we're not aware of that the community cares about that may be flood prone as well. So again, public input is very important. And variables that may influence preservation priorities, public sentiment, economic importance, level of historical and cultural significance, and the remaining integrity, the remaining level of original material, and the look and feel of the property and how it represents its historical condition. Estimating historic building replacement costs. As you can probably imagine, it's very difficult to place a dollar value on very elaborate and unique craftsmanship on historic buildings, but these estimations are necessary to understand the cost effectiveness of various hazard mitigation alternatives. The FEMA guidance recommends, because historic buildings are often valued in the same way that a modern building might be valued with modern day materials, which is very much the case. The FEMA guidance recommends using a multiplier for historic buildings of 20 to 25% so that those buildings' unique craftsmanship and elaborate architectural details are adequately valued and reflected in that value assessment. And a qualified preservation architect or rehabilitation specialist can assist with these estimations. Developing a mitigation plan. This is where we start to develop very specific strategies for historic properties that have been prioritized. In Pennsylvania, with regard to flood-prone properties, the number one flood mitigation technique that's funded through the use of FEMA dollars is acquisition and demolition. So the municipality is able to, through the use of FEMA hazard mitigation grant funds or other FEMA grant funds, purchase that property, demolish it, and it becomes open space in perpetuity. Obviously, this is problematic because for all the reasons we discussed, historic properties add such value to communities and provide a sense of place. And so if that building's demolished, it's lost forever, and it can have a drastic impact on the look and feel of the community. So there currently are some policy disconnects between the State Historic Preservation Office. Obviously, the State Historic Preservation Office would like to see other alternatives beyond demolition for our historic properties that could help to preserve these properties. But Traditionally, PEMA has prioritized demolition because the idea that we've got to get folks out of the floodplain, out of harm's way. But this contradictory policy between our agencies is something that we're working very closely to find middle ground with PEMA and FEMA currently. So thinking about alternatives to demolition in Pennsylvania, relocation is one of those alternatives. In fact, it's an alternative that can help preserve a property, but removing a property from its original location can again have impacts on surrounding historic properties or the look and feel of the community. So what alternatives are there beyond demolition and relocation? And importantly, what alternatives may minimize risk without compromising the integrity and the historic fabric in the community? When identifying those alternatives, evaluating the cost effectiveness is very important and will in fact be required for communities that seek to use FEMA or federal grant funding to mitigate their historic properties. Again, considering the impacts of actions on historic buildings, the appearance, the setting, the scale, what types of impacts could flood mitigation techniques have on the look and feel of these properties? An example at the top left corner of the screen. What happens if you elevate one or two houses on a row? You can see the drastic difference or visual impact that you could have there. It totally changes the whole look and feel of a neighborhood. Here, bottom left image shows an alternative for elevating historic properties that could help to disguise the elevations through the use of landscaping treatments. There are some alternatives out there, but it's a complex issue that we're really struggling with, and throughout phase 2 of our disaster planning for historic properties projects, we really hope to address this issue and develop some real innovative out-of-the-box solutions. Here we have a table showing the risk reduction versus the level of impact to historic properties. So, for example, wet floodproofing, allowing the water to come in to a building, or dry floodproofing, keeping the water out, waterproofing the building. These have a low level of impact, negative impact to historic properties, but at the same time, they don't reduce risk very much. On the flip side, you've got acquisition and demolition or relocation. They reduce a whole lot of risk, but they have a huge negative impact to historic properties. So again, this is a real complex issue with no real perfect answers. In Philadelphia, we're fortunate to have partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers will help to survey approximately half of those 1,000 historic properties that are flood prone throughout the city. And they're also bringing in their National Non-Structural Flood Proofing Committee, which does projects nationwide. The Army Corps of Engineers recently did some work in another historic community along the East Coast here in Annapolis, Maryland. And in Annapolis, they were able to identify several flood mitigation techniques for some of the historic buildings in Annapolis' historic district. Although in Annapolis, they didn't really address the issue of what those mitigation techniques or how those techniques could minimize negative impacts to the historic resource. So that's something that we'll have them take a closer look at in Philadelphia through the help of bringing folks in from local architecture firms and the local universities, Drexel University, Penn, for example, and trying to really tackle that complex problem. We'll also seek guidance from a variety of international best practices that are out there for historic property flood mitigation. Some great resources coming out of England right now, from the Gulf Coast, elevation design guidelines in Florida. But the elevation design guidelines for the Gulf Coast may not really apply in places like Philadelphia or many of our old Pennsylvania river towns where we've got an abundance of masonry buildings. So, for example, it might be easy to elevate a wood frame house on the Gulf Coast, but can you elevate a whole row of brick houses in Philadelphia? It's probably not feasible or cost effective. By 2017, when our pilot projects of our Disaster Planning for Historic Properties initiative are complete, we hope to have guidance for all 67 counties and the remainder of our 18 Hurricane Sandy declaration counties. And in fact, we're working very closely with the Pennsylvania Emergency Management to update their standard operating guide, which is the checklist, if you will, that communities must use when updating their hazard mitigation plans. Currently, historic property considerations are absent from that checklist, but by the time their standard operating guide is updated by 2018, those considerations will hopefully be a part of that checklist. And as a result, all 67 counties beginning in 2018 will be required to integrate historic property considerations. So with all that, I suppose I'll open it up for questions.
Jeremy, it looks like Andrew has a question there. He's in the chat box. Andrew says, your talk was interesting and thank you. He was wondering what led you to becoming interested and involved in this area of work.
That's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. You know, it's funny. I went to school at Millersville and got a geography degree and specialized in GIS, and I wanted to become a city planner. So I went for my master's in urban planning, and I got a certificate in real estate development. And when I was moving back to Pennsylvania from Oregon after my graduate program, I was looking for work, and I saw this opportunity, and I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to bring my skills from geography and GIS and planning to the State Historic Preservation Office, which only has a few practicing planners working in the office. This seemed like a really, really excellent opportunity to innovate, which is something I'm very excited about. And I think this project will really bring Pennsylvania to the forefront of innovation with regard to integrating historic properties into the hazard planning process. And in fact, in the spring, in April 2016, I've been invited to speak at a conference in Newport, Rhode Island, where they're bringing experts from around the U.S. and Europe, folks from Venice and Rotterdam and the U.K., to tackle the issue of protecting historic properties in coastal areas. And so, you know, in just a short time, folks are starting to notice the things that Pennsylvania is doing to plan for its historic properties, and to me that's very exciting. You're welcome.
Brian, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Jeremy, question for you. We heard from Leslie Williams back in September talking about her initiatives in Colorado. Obviously, this is an emerging field of interest, belatedly, considering we just went through the earthquake damage on Washington Monument not too recently, not too long ago either. What is the depth of resources here in Pennsylvania to approach this? Because it is an enormous interagency cooperative effort to realize the goals you outlined.
Could you hear from me, Brian? I'm sorry, you were breaking up a little bit there. Could you just repeat the end part of your question?
The last portion, please. What are the depth of resources at your disposal to affect such a complex interagency cooperative to be able to realize your goals?
That's a really great question. Thank you, Brian. So I should start by saying that when I started in my position, as a follow-up to the last question, in fact, I didn't have a whole, I didn't come from a historic preservation background, and I certainly didn't come from an emergency management background. So I had a double learning curve coming into this position, and it took me several months to really feel comfortable discussing this topic. And along with my learning curve, a huge part of my role moving into my position here last year was developing those really important relationships with PEMA and FEMA, which hadn't really existed between our office before. We had some involvement with them in 2002 when we developed the Milton River Towns Guide, but beyond that, we really only had contact with FEMA or PEMA when a disaster had already struck and, for example, a town was seeking to acquire and demolish a series of properties along the riverfront to mitigate using FEMA funding. That was the extent of our relationship, but as of this point, we have a really great relationship that's only strengthening now between PEMA and FEMA and the State Historic Preservation Office, and we've had a lot of opportunities to infuse historic property considerations into the state hazard mitigation plan. So we're not only impacting the local hazard mitigation plan, but also the state plan, which really has impacts, sort of a top-down approach there, if you will. But we're also working over the next year to continue our outreach to communities and to a variety of historic preservation and emergency management organizations, first responders, so that we can get those types of folks thinking about how to properly approach historic properties within the disaster context so that they're adequately preserved. In fact, next summer, the summer of 2016, there will be an opportunity for graduate students in emergency management to work as a contractor for the State Historic Preservation Office as we develop some of these initiatives. So if that sounds like something you may be interested in, please send me an email. I hope you can see my email address there. We will be looking for some bright students from the emergency management program, and it sounds like we've got an abundance of those at Millersville. So if you'd like some more information about that, feel free to reach out. I hope that answered your question, Brian.
Thank you. I hope to talk further with you.
You're welcome.
And Jeremy, it looks like Courtney has one other question here. She says in the chat box, great presentation. What is the most interesting experience you have had to deal with in your position?
Thank you, Courtney. That's a great question as well. Wow, I've had many very interesting experiences. I would have to say, while it was a challenge and it was somewhat difficult in the early days, trying to establish those critical relationships between the State Historic Preservation Office and the state and federal emergency management agencies, it was very rewarding, and I think those relationships are starting to pay off, as I mentioned. But it was quite a struggle early on, and it was very difficult to get the ear of the emergency management folks. Historic preservation can be so foreign to non-preservation professionals, and sometimes it's very easy to see the benefits of historic properties in your community, but at the same time it can be very difficult to understand the benefits that those historic properties can have on communities, and very difficult to convince the emergency management professionals that these are properties that are worth prioritizing. Obviously life and property will always be the #1 concern, as it should be in emergency management, but hopefully we can get historic properties up to the level where they're almost as important as those critical facilities, your fire stations, your hospitals, your schools, and so forth, because these these really are the bedrock of our communities, and they deserve our efforts to preserve and prioritize. I hope that answered your question, Courtney. And I wanted to go back to Brian's question too. You asked what sort of resources we have to leverage to begin the important work of prioritizing historic properties. So as I mentioned, when historic property considerations are infused into a hazard mitigation plan, which is ultimately approved by FEMA, that mitigation plan's mitigation strategies are prioritized for funding from FEMA. And again, if there are strategies that are not in the hazard mitigation plan, they won't be eligible for FEMA grants. But for those strategies that we develop for historic properties that are integrated into the hazard mitigation plans, they will be eligible for a variety of FEMA funding, flood mitigation assistance, the hazard mitigation grant program, and a variety of others. It's also important to note that the State Historic Preservation Office here in Pennsylvania has the Keystone Historic Preservation Grant Program, which I mentioned earlier, and that provides funding for communities to plan for their resources, as well as bricks and mortar projects, funds for bricks and mortar projects, which in many cases could be implemented to protect a historic property so long as it's done appropriately.
Are there any other questions? Well, I just want to thank Jeremy for taking the time out of his day to present this information to us. I know I learned a lot about historic preservation of properties, so I think it was a great presentation, and I just want to thank Jeremy again on behalf of everyone here at the CBRE. Thank you so much for taking the time and presenting this to us. So with that, everybody have a great day, have a great weekend, and we'll see you next semester for our virtual seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Chris.